Welcome to the first Tai Luntan, which is Mandarin for the Tai Initiative Forum, a new series exploring many of the practical issues affecting leaders in the subnational U.S.-China relations dialogue. We're excited about starting this new journey in the world of webcasting. Thank you to our Tai Initiative listeners out there, mutually interested in hearing and thinking about two different perspectives on getting to know China. We're glad to be discovering who you are. Please let us know you watched today's webcast. We also invite commentary from your own perspective on what it means as an American to get to know China. Though we don't have a two-way live interactive method today, we invite you to send your questions or observations to admin@taiinitiative.org. As we receive these inputs, we'll incorporate them into our discussion. This broadcast will last for just under 1 hour. Today we're going to hold a conversation between Carson Tavenner, the Executive Director of the Tai Initiative, and Chad Auer, former Mayor of Firestone, Colorado, and current President of the U.S.-China Cooperative Association of Elected Local Officials, and a key speaker on the panel of mayors the Tai Initiative formed at our second annual conference held this past May in Denver. Carson, Chad, thanks for getting together today, and let's talk about getting to know China better.
Great to be here. Thank you.
So I'd like to start us off today with some short introductions about how you share some similarities, but also have many striking differences. You're both passionate about U.S.-China relations. You each show some natural disposition towards diplomacy. And you're both from lower middle-class Caucasian families and have grown up in a rural setting. Both interested in guiding the future of the Tai Initiative to influence others, and in terms of that influence, when it comes to the U.S.-China relationship, you both want our communities and our leaders to act differently than they generally are. So let's hear from you, from each of you, for a few moments about your personal journeys getting to know China. So if we could begin, Chad, with you.
Sure. Thank you, Ben. Well, my journey in U.S.-China relations started in my role as a mayor, and it really can be summarized in the following, in that, in my view, to be a good mayor, I needed to be sure that Firestone was positioned globally. It wasn't enough to just be positioned in our region or in our state or even in the United States. It was there's an imperative, and it's important to position our community in that global marketplace, so to speak. Therefore, you can't go too far into discussions about the global marketplace or the global community without coming into contact with the issue of China and contemplating what the implications are for any community, whether it's in Colorado or the United States or, frankly, any community around the world. You can't go too far into that conversation and contemplation without, like I said, thinking about and being confronted with the realities of China. So that was really my beginning in this journey, and then over the years I've been able to serve on a variety of different panels and diplomatic type of scenarios, and you know, the journey continues. I was term limited as mayor, but my interest in my exploration of China has not been term limited and never will, hopefully.
Okay.
I like that. Well said. Not wanting to see our experiences term limited, and don't think it necessarily will. I like that. I've been going through a number of terms. If I may, Ben, I presume that we'd do a little introduction of where I'm coming from. I've been actively exploring relations with China since 1986. That was when, in high school, as a young man who was focused mostly in the math and science area, I was inspired and encouraged by a leadership program to get involved in thinking about community. And part of that thinking about community was international community. I was headed for the military at the time, and I had no intention on being really involved in international relations. I mostly wanted to fly the United States Air Force, and I did go into the Air Force, to the Air Force Academy, starting in 1987. But that wasn't without an interest in first getting to know a little bit more about this country, which in the mid-'80s was still very unknown to the United States. I'd recently opened up, and I was aware of the fact that we would have some relations and some ability to be interested in China in the future. That really just kind of led to a street-level knowledge, if you will, a cultural knowledge of China as I got to know pen pal. I watched the events of the late '80s unfold, enter into a military career, knowing that someday it would be neat to professionally connect with this, but not seeing a real path forward for that at the time. Then I was very fortunate in the context of my service with the Air Force to be sent to go study international relations and teach history at the United States Air Force Academy, where I taught world history, Asian history, and the history of communist China. Those experiences helped bring in, for me, an academic understanding and a more professional perspective on what was happening between the US and China in their relations. And as I then retired from the Air Force in 2011, by then I had realized many of the things that need to be done between our people and many of the ways in which the good things that are already happening between Americans and Chinese need to be greater elevated and better known, and that the leadership of these efforts needs to be better networked together. And that really led to an interest in getting started with this nonprofit leadership, which is now in the form of the Tai Initiative. We go forward from this military experience and national government involvement into now being a nonprofit leader. Since starting that nonprofit leadership, I've traveled to China probably 5 to 8 times more than I ever had before, and have continued to learn as we listen to what's going on among the Chinese and the issues that they face and the needs that they have. And I look forward to helping meet some of those needs in the years to come. I know that's just a very short smattering of a longer experience, but it's one that I think is valuable because it has stepped through a number of different kinds of experiences. Getting to see what it's like being on hard sleeper train in the late '80s, early '90s is a great thing to have now kind of in my background, in my mind's eye, getting to remember what China was recently like. And even then it was more advanced than it had been in the '50s and '60s. To compare to the China of today, when you first experience it in the 21st century, it's a little harder, I think, to compare and to understand just the quantity and the quality of change that's occurred.
Thank you for these reflections, gentlemen. So getting further into today's talk, the Tai Initiative really believes that more Americans need to be more educated about the realities of China. And one of the first big obstacles is getting around the meaning of being Chinese and the meaning of being American. So let's talk about that. Carson, could you lead off?
Sure, and I believe that in terms of our format here, what we'll really be ending up with here is an opportunity for Chad and I to be discussing back and forth our ideas and the things that we've been reflecting on that are similar in their intent, but different in our experiences. I think it's very important for us to think about these two questions, what it means to be American and what it means to be Chinese, because for so many of us, we have not really engaged that question even for our own identity. There are an increasing number of Americans who, knowing that China is important, and yet also knowing that they in their lives don't have much of a connection to China, are increasingly asking themselves the question, what do I need to know? You know, about 20 years ago, it would be really easy to find Americans who didn't even want to know anything about China. Really no interest, wasn't really on their radar. No wonder they didn't know anything. The issue today is that more and more Americans are recognizing China is really important. I really ought to know something. And when they think about that question, they realize they really don't know much. And they only have the opportunity to believe and to learn from the media signals that are sent out to them on a pretty regular basis, almost all of which are really focused on national level issues. Now, once you begin to get involved in the U.S.-China relationship and you start to interact, for us for Americans, Caucasian, rural Americans like Chad and I, to interact with China, there's a whole number of different ways and levels at which this interaction occurs. It is initially foreign. It is initially exciting. Sometimes you might use the word exotic. But as you get to know Chinese, you begin to realize, and we learn that important fundamental human lesson, these are people just like us. They have a totally different culture. They have a different outlook. Of course, the language is different. The history is different. But so many of the core interests are really very similar. And it's easy to get along. As you get to know, I find in my life, as I have gotten to know my Chinese friends better and better, I've begun to realize the depth with which there is an identity in being Chinese. And when you are American Chinese, this begins to be a very interesting identity about what that really means. We don't have an easy answer. We won't have an answer for that question today. It's the exploration into what's important. The flip side of this is for us to also think about what it means to be American. And I keep telling people, when you talk about the U.S.-China relationship, from the perspective of being in America, you have to remember that the U.S. brings a whole half to that relationship. Often people talking about U.S.-China are really just thinking about China. We should be thinking about ourselves and what we bring to it, what are our values, what are our restrictions, in ways that are fundamentally civilizational. And what does it really mean? And we could go on and on. I will stop for now to hear any Chad's responses and perspectives on this.
Well, I appreciate that, Carson. I love hearing your perspectives on China, and I continue to learn about those two questions and about my role in this very complex issue, U.S.-China relations, and appreciate your views. I guess if I could weigh in on the question of what does it mean to be an American, what does it mean to be Chinese, and maybe attack it or weigh in from the perspective of my experience as an elected official. And to do that, I would like to first start by just summarizing my trip to China, which is my first trip. Hopefully it's first of many, but I took that almost a year ago, exactly. It was right at the end of August, 1st of September in 2013. The itinerary was 3 major cities. We first went to Shanghai, and then to Nanning, and then ultimately to Beijing. Along the way, our itinerary included meetings with a lot of officials in China. One, the chairman of the China Energy Fund Committee, as well as some university leaders in Shanghai. Then, when we were in Nanning, we were part of a cultural festival, as well as a summit of elected officials from around the world. There were mayors from around the world, and it was an enormous honor for me to be one of the speakers there and engage in dialogue with other municipal leaders, and very specifically with Chinese local officials. And I'll get back to that. But then ultimately we went to Beijing, where we had a series of other meetings with government officials. All of them were very productive, and they centered around this central theme of, what can we do together? And the obvious first answer is economic development. Both China and the United States obviously have interests in the global marketplace, and elected officials in both countries, in different ways, but in both countries have an impact on what it means to develop economically. Certainly, the United States and China have very strong economies, thriving economies. Some might argue whether whose is stronger. Some folks at any given time, looking at the metrics, we can discuss the nuances of that. But generally speaking, the world is looking to both of us in terms of economic signals and strength. So if I could then get back to what does it mean to be an elected official in the United States, and maybe just a short glimpse in my reflections on what I've learned from my counterparts in China. The first is that of the local government officials that I've met in China, and actually when they've come to the United States, I've had a few occasions to meet Chinese officials here in our country at different conferences and summits. certainly there are a lot of differences, right? Our cultural differences, our roles, our job descriptions as mayors are pretty different. On the other hand, the similarities I think are worth noting, and a couple of them are we're asked to be stewards of our communities, and that is we're asked to tend to the needs and the current needs of our communities, but also to look to the future and do the necessary planning and engagement, etc. Again, obviously we go about it differently in different countries, in the United States and China, but again, that core principle and that core imperative is there. Economic development and public safety, infrastructure, etc., are all a part of that discussion. Given the rapid growth in China, the urbanization in China, my role as the vice chair of the Denver Metro Mayor's Caucus was of interest to them because we've experienced a lot of growth in the Denver metro region, and in fact Firestone was the fastest growing community in the state of Colorado according to the Census Bureau in the last census. So we understood exponential growth. A little footnote to that, when we talk exponential growth in Colorado, it is exponential, but the magnitude of the exponential growth that happens in a number of these urban centers in China is enormous. A community of 300,000 may be considered a village to them, where here in the United States that's a pretty major metropolitan area. Nonetheless, we had a lot of opportunities to dialogue about what does rapid growth and urbanization and what does that mean to lead a community that way, in all the respects that I mentioned earlier. Is a key element to successful, in my view at least, successful subnational relations, and there's a lot of common ground to be found. The other thing that I just mentioned is at the end of the day, while we're wearing our suits and ties and all of us elected officials have all these handlers and we have all of this circumstance that is just comes with the job, particularly in China, at the end of the day, we're human beings, and we are fathers, we're parents, we want great schools for our kids, we want communities to be safe, we want to serve our communities well, and that's another, I think, important common ground that the United States and China has, particularly at the subnational level. It's been a huge honor for me to nurture or to have friendships with fellow local officials in China, and those relationships, have become friendships, as I said, and those friendships will. I look forward to those enduring for a lifetime, sharing ideas, sharing challenges. Sometimes, we confide in each other to a degree in the struggles, or share stories, so to speak, and then at the same time sharing in each other's successes.
That's great. Thank you.
Chad, I'm really glad to hear you. Go ahead, Ben.
So if we would, let's move the conversation past personal identity ideas and more towards knowing China. So we see that there are a lot of difficulties wrapped up in the use of our words when giving people identities. So how about the identity of China as a civilization? How can we get to know it better? Carson, your thoughts?
I think a perfect answer to that question is found in what Chad was just concluding on, reflecting about friendships. We have known for a long time that people really get to enjoy being together when they know each other individually. There is everything real in relationships between Americans and Chinese when manifested at the individual level. Somebody meeting someone else, liking them, getting to know them as a friend, dedicating some time to them, dedicating some energy to that relationship, whether it be through invitation, whether it be for eating, whatever programs we're working together, whatever it is we do together, with our friends when done in a friendly manner, when done in order to generate better relationship. There's hardly anything more real in our lives than that. And I'm really glad that Chad brought that up. Chad, another thing that you brought up that makes me think about the struggle that we face in getting to know China is that there are so many fundamental differences in the structuring of society, politics, and I guess I would say cultural interaction that are very difficult to know if we understand correctly. And this is not only true for us toward the Chinese way, this is also the fact when someone who lives in the PRC comes and interacts in America. We're talking about expectations of when and how to speak with a stranger. We're talking about expectations of when and how to speak when at a meal. It would be pointless to go on and list all the different practical different ways in which this manifests, but you mentioned that they're so different. There are two key differences that I think we particularly are struggling with at the subnational level, and that is that there is a party involvement in government in a way that we understand but don't comprehend. We know it's there, but we know that we don't really understand the strength and the value of it from the Chinese perspective. Similar, I think, in this way to the existence of the nonprofit sector and the civil sector and civil society in America, which is small in China and growing, but it's something generally people are completely unaccustomed to working with. And how the nonprofit sector works, how civil society works, is something that they're aware of as an important element in America, but it's hard for them to connect to. And I think that these really come in affecting the way in which municipal governments and even friends communicate with one another when it comes to getting to know each other.
Chad, your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I think you're right on. It's from my perspective. Again, I'll weigh in and share from an elected official's view. My goal or a passion of mine when I'm traveling internationally, particularly in China, is to see the real China or the real country. Let me unpack that a little bit. When an elected official visits China, there are local handlers there that greet us, and we have a structured itinerary. The hospitality is fantastic, and everybody takes very good care of us. But at the same time, it's a bit of a challenge then for somebody like me to see something that's not on the itinerary, essentially. But that to me is really the fabric, and really, again, it's something that I really enjoy. So there's a challenge there. And to be very candid and honest, when dignitaries would visit my community, of course I wanted to show off my community as well, right? I want to show the best of the community, and I want to, I don't want to say, put a plastic look to it, but at the same time, I want to show it off a bit, and I think that's a natural human thing to want to do. But at the same time, an authentic relationship requires that we go a little bit deeper, and we see each other in our entirety. So that's has been particularly, I think it's challenging for local officials because our pride gets in the way, frankly, and that's not something that is just an experience of Americans. I think any leader around the world feels that pressure to. We're proud, right? We're proud of our communities, and we want to show it off. So that's a barrier, I think, and one of the things that makes it difficult for me to say this is how you get to know China. On the other hand, there's huge opportunities because you can't, frankly, no matter how hard you try, if a relationship becomes a friendship over time, you're going to see Firestone in its entirety, or a local community in China in its entirety, and that's okay. But there's a level of trust that needs to be there, and the only way to get to that level of trust, frankly, is to nurture and to continue to build those subnational relationships, provide opportunities for those elected officials to get together and to get over ourselves and to move from diplomatic interaction to relationship and ultimately to friendship.
Couldn't have said it better. That is so wonderful. As we know, the challenge comes with the fact that in both countries, our positions keep turning over through promotions, through life changes and career changes. People don't have the capacity to build the relationship personally because of the position that they hold. This is the real dedication comes when the individual Chinese or American leader decides that they in their lives are going to give that time and that energy despite the position, so that when the position and the job is over and you've moved on, that relationship doesn't just go away. I think that this is the area where we can really see a benefit in both countries to promote the idea among local leaders that they ought to want to do this. I don't think that we have a lot of evidence right now to broadly share with a larger population that there's value for them in doing so. If you're not already interested in China, what is it that gets you interested in knowing more about it? I think this is where I'd like to hear a bit more of your reflections, Chad. Certainly a lot of people in my life who are interested in China, it's because they're Chinese or because they've originally been studying it as kids. There's kind of an academic interest to it. But there's got to be more than an academic calling in people's lives, more than just a professional calling to want to get interested in this. Kind of back to my earlier comments, just saying that more Americans, I can tell, are becoming aware of their need to know more. They're aware that they don't know much, even though they really aren't particularly interested in making something of China in their lives. How do we provide that opportunity to them? How do we provide those methods? I think that one quick thing that we should share with everyone when we can is to encourage people to read and to be careful about what you're reading and to be specific about grabbing and trying to get information about China instead of just passively receiving it from those who are sending it to you. You need to read. You also need to listen, and not listen to the radio and listen to the TV. You need to listen to friends in your lives who have some experiences with China. These could be Chinese Americans. These could be Chinese foreign nationals. These could be non-Chinese, anybody else who has had an experience. I think of one of my new friends here in the Seattle area. She's Israeli. She has been involved in Israeli-Chinese relations. It is fantastic to get to learn about China from an Israeli who is involved in Israeli-Chinese relations. I think that's been a great opportunity to learn from her about China. So you need to listen to people, you need to read, and you need, as you were saying, Chad, you need to visit. And you've had one visit, and you're looking forward to your second. Many of us have had multiple visits. We should always let those visits have in them an element of seeking to learn something new. And I think it's with a country and as a people as large as China and with a people as large as America, it's not difficult to always learn something new. What's one of the things, Chad, that you didn't learn when you were in China that you want to learn the next time you visit?
Lots of things. One of the things, Carson, that I would like to learn is, I'll mention two. The first one is I'd like to learn and meet and interact with the agricultural, the more rural communities. I didn't get the opportunity to do that. I didn't get, it wasn't on my itinerary or my agenda that was prepared for me. The reason I think, the reason there's value in that, and the reason that I would want to do that is because a nation is both urban and rural. It's and when you think about, and if you, for me, I want to authentically engage in in a relationship, a subnational relationship with China, it's going to require that I increase my contacts or increase my awareness and visits with the wide variety, the China in its entirety. Maybe I don't have enough days in my life to visit all of that or to accomplish that, but even to just take steps toward understanding and seeing the spectrum of what China, what it means to be Chinese, and particularly what it means for Chinese citizens in a more rural or further away from the large urban centers. I think there's a lot of value there. I would like to see that. I would like to interact with that. Maybe it's because I wear cowboy boots and I have an affinity for that. I think it's more than that. Yeah, and I mentioned two things, or I said there are a couple of things, but that's probably the top one there.
Yeah, the agricultural part is very important. It makes me think about the exciting story that most of the people in our country and in China are just starting to get to unpack, and that is the story of Xi Jinping. Here you are, the #1 leader in China, and his background has in it this agricultural level experience in Iowa. For those who are listening to us who are not aware, in the mid-'80s, Xi Jinping, at the time a young staffer within the party and government, came and lived and interacted in Iowa on a farm for a number of days, and in that experience, quickly, in the early part of his life, grew to know the real rural story of America, how Americans live at home, how we interact with each other, and formed lasting friendships that were specifically nurtured over the years to the point where now that house, that family, that community, in fact that entire state, has a very close relationship at the subnational level with leaders in China who are at the national level. And this is something that our national governments are very aware of. Lots of people are interested in the possibilities that this interaction and this experience might mean for us. With all this going on with Xi Jinping and his politics right now in China, we cannot say with any grain of truth that this relationship with Iowa is at the forefront of his mind, nor that it is having some kind of immediate, direct effect on our national politics. But I'm hopeful, as you shared here, Chad, your interest in getting to know the agricultural piece, I'm hopeful that by their having at their top leadership a fundamentally agricultural experience in America, one that generated friendships, that will draw out over the course of the next 8 to 10 years a really fantastic story that we can be encouraged by and that we can build real things on. How to do that? Now, that's a matter of further discussion, isn't it?
Yeah, it absolutely is. I know that in my experience, in addition to agriculture, the issue of energy, energy production, energy development, and ultimately global energy markets is another sector that provides a platform for us to share common interest to a problem that we can both solve, hopefully. If we can navigate our own politics within our respective nations, I think that the United States and China can get the energy issue right if we do it well, and it's going to require strong subnational relationships.
Indeed, if I may, on that very topic of getting the politics right, if you will, informing political discussions led by subnational leaders, elected officials, appointed, and so forth, with accurate information on China. I think it would be good to kind of wrap up the conversation with discussing near-term issues in political races, the ideas which lead people who are running for mayor or running for city council to kind of associate a relationship with China or to attribute that as a potential political loss versus a gain. What have been some of your observations as an elected local official who has rubbed shoulders with other city government officials and the kinds of sentiments that you've heard about, let's say, equating relationships at the local level with China as something of a political loss. And what do you think might be done to help solve that problem?
Sure. Well, I appreciate that question. I think it deserves lots of thought and consideration and discussion all over the country. As you said, in school board races, in local races for city council, mayor, county commissioners, this isn't just an issue at the Washington, D.C., Beijing level. In fact, I'm a firm believer in the adage that the future of the United States and China's relationship is not going to be determined as much in Washington, D.C. and Beijing as it will in the individual communities in both of our countries, which again circles back to the point here. Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, as elected officials, as political animals, as these politicians, we have to do the political math, and part of it is winning elections is a part of the game. In order to have influence and in order to participate, you have to win the elections. A part of that math, that political calculus, if you will, is to prioritize certain issues or deprioritize others. An unfortunate reality, in my view, and what I've observed, is that the issue of China, or the idea that the United States and China, diplomacy therein, building a healthy U.S.-China relationship, that is a political, a losing political issue for a number of candidates and a number of elected officials, which, in my view, I think is very short-sighted. It's sort of a, I don't know how to say it other than to be pretty blunt, is that it's a pretty sophomoric way to approach politics, but that happens fairly regularly.
I think if I may interject something, I think an important point to understand and make here for our listeners to think about is whether or not, when China does enter any element of the dialogue during an election, are the comments being made about China comments that are part of just a canvas of an unimportant issue? Are they just simply, that's where I don't believe that China itself is enough of an important issue to the electorate in America right now that politicians are actually stopping to think and decide what is their policy and what is their orientation toward China. I think instead we're dealing with a lot of perceptions of officials desiring election, that the American population does not generally look favorably on China, and therefore, for the sake of my real issues, I will use the canvas of not necessarily supporting a pro-China policy. And likewise, there is a perception on the part of Americans broadly that China is something to be feared, or that China is something to be held at bay because of this sense of an impending overt aggression. Both perspectives are not largely built on facts and reality. There are a lot of very disturbing facts at the national level, particularly with regards to China's aggressiveness, and also Americans need to be more aware of how America looks aggressive in China. These are certainly not fantasy issues. There are real problems. But I think that the problem that I'd like to hear you acknowledging here in your comments is the problem of it being the problem of election-related comments vis-a-vis China being based on perception, not based on real experience or knowledge.
I absolutely agree with that, and it's campaign rhetoric is particularly in our current age is seen by the world. So a politically expedient campaign message or comments that are somehow, based on inaccurate perceptions and sort of paint the United States and China's relationship as one of aggression and large gaps and a very competitive or antagonistic relationship. Those, unfortunately, I think have local or political value, and I use that term very loosely. But the problem is that while they might have short-term political value, they are enormously damaging to the bigger issue of establishing and maintaining a healthy relationship, a positive, a mutually positive and beneficial relationship between the United States and China. Again, in ages or in years past, a candidate can say something on the stump somewhere along the campaign trail, and it never showed up on YouTube or on the internet somewhere where a student in Shanghai might be doing a research project and be searching around, and or I don't know, maybe a student at DU here in Colorado might be doing some research and find some rhetoric that is really unfortunate and is counterproductive to this overall deal. So I think it's a great discussion, or a great topic, and it's one that I think we really need to reflect on as elected officials in the United States. We're going to need to have some courage, frankly. A number of elected officials or candidates are going to have the courage to look beyond the local rhetoric and look towards contributing to a long-term global solution.
I'd like to know, Chad, if you have any anecdotes from the past few years as you've stepped into your experience in life getting to know China. Are there any examples of things that, as you had real experiences with interacting with Chinese or in your travel to China, are there any examples of things that taught you that the reality was different from what you had originally perceived? Because before you started being involved as Mayor of Firestone, certainly you would have had some level of a belief or an understanding about China, taught to you because of just the passive information that comes at you. Once you stepped in and had a real opportunity to experience, and you had experiences in listening and in visiting, I'm not sure how much reading you have done previously, but I would like to know if you have any particular anecdotes of ways in which, as an elected official, your eyes were opened and you realized, oh, I see this differently now. Are there any?
Well, let me first make sure I understand the question. The way how I see China differently?
Yes. Yeah. In other words, if we're saying here, and we are saying that a large number of Americans perceive China based on perceptions, not based on a known experience or a reality of learning something deliberately. So that was true for you, that was true for me, that was true for Ben at some point in our lives. All three of us have, more recently and longer in different cases, all three of us have had experiences in which we have gotten to actually know China through reading, through listening, through experiencing. And when that happens, inevitably there are some things that make us go, wow, that is a lot different than I thought it was, based on perception. So I'm curious, because you're the most recent discovery, and you're the one who has had an elected local official perspective, I'm curious if there are any anecdotes of those that you can share.
I'm going to point to one, is that when I was sitting at dinner with the chairman of the China Energy Fund Committee, which is a very powerful entity in China, and Mr. Chairman is obviously in a very influential role. We sat next to each other, and as we all do, right, we put our smartphones face up somewhere near our water so that we can always be connected and make sure that we know what's happening. Well, we put both of our phones up at the same time on the table right next to each other, and we both had the same iPhones, which we laughed about. And the language barrier is very difficult, right? Because we both had interpreters at our sides, and speaking through interpreters is challenging, but it works. at any rate, when we started to acknowledge the fact that we both had iPhones, immediately, you probably guessed what we started doing. We opened our iPhones and we started showing each other pictures of our families. So that, again, that kind of goes back to one of the things I mentioned earlier, is that we have a lot in common. Before these experiences that I've had, and before, my wife reminded me that I've done actually quite a bit of reading about the China, trying to catch up, because I feel like my history education in China wasn't all that good. Obviously I didn't attend your classes, Carson, or I would be very well versed. You know, my initial impression was we had nothing in common, or very little in common, and we were two countries headed in different directions, or at least we were headed full on towards each other in an aggressive way. Two very different philosophies of government, to war, I guess, or significant conflict was our end. But again, as a small example, the fact that we're both using iPhones, and we're both showing each other pictures and videos of our families, demonstrated to me and really taught me that, wow, the gap isn't as big as, the gap between he and I was not nearly as big as the gap between Washington, D.C. and Beijing from a political or a geopolitical level. I don't know if that answers your question or if that helps.
I like that you put it there at the end, that the gap wasn't nearly as big. I like the way you said that, because we don't want to send a message that there isn't a gap.
Yeah.
And I also don't think that we want to be seen as naively trying to say that just because you and this official had this experience, that somehow undoes the reality of there being a gap.
Absolutely.
I think it's important that people not perceive the message of cooperation with China as a message that says ignore the problems and ignore the fact that there is a gap, because there are ways in which there's aggression. There are ways in which there's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of fear that's not grounded on, that is grounded on some principles. And what I'm taking away from your experience is that you're contrasting this experience with what you might have otherwise expected going in, that the official, if the official had expressed some form of personal level aggression towards you, or doubt, or some level of, what's the word I'm looking for? Doubt or insincerity would probably be the best words. That wouldn't necessarily have struck you as something unexpected. You might have expected it because of your sense of things, but by having the experience, it sounds like you were struck by a sense of, wow, I wasn't expecting this guy to be quite so hospitable. I wasn't expecting this guy to be quite like me in the way that he is.
Agreed.
Okay.
Absolutely.
All right, that's great. I think that we owe it to our Chinese partners, whether it be in a professional capacity or in a personal capacity, to flip that whole experience around and to think about how, when they come to America and they see us, or when we go to China and we experience them, what is it about our behavior? What is it about some of the things that we're doing that help them to discount some of the negative media that they get in their country? This is something that's very, very difficult for us to have any authoritative perspective on, because we don't have that perspective. You know, we're not fundamentally looking at it that way. I look forward to conversations like this in the future, where we can bring in our Chinese counterparts. We can bring in both Chinese American view, and we can bring in the Chinese national view.
Yes, indeed. With that said, we're about out of time, gentlemen. So, if there are any closing comments.
Well, one thing on this aspect that I want to close out with, that I don't think we adequately addressed at the beginning, was understanding that as we say U.S.-China relations, we need to be careful in what we're imagining in our minds when we say this, because U.S. is that nation-state identity of the United States of America, and that true counterpart is the People's Republic of China, PRC. But for a lot of reasons, I think mostly out of simplicity, we've stopped saying PRC and we say China. But when you talk about China just as a singular word, and you just say, what is China? You have just opened up a question that brings in a lot more than what right now is just PRC. We're talking about history, we're talking about culture, a lot of things that existed before the PRC are Chinese. So I want us to remember that when we say U.S.-China, we've got to be careful about the degree to which we are or are not deliberately bringing in national perspectives of a political nature and the degree to which we're bringing in an understood ethnicity. It's very, very easy, too easy, to make the mistake in these conversations when we say American to think that you're talking about somebody who looks like Chad and I. And the fact is, most Americans don't look like Chad and I, right? And we have got to acknowledge in this conversation the great value of American Chinese, of different generational connections as well, and Chinese living in America for an extended period of time. We've got to acknowledge the very, very valuable perspective that they bring. It's easy to think Han-Chinese when you say Chinese. And the fact is, a lot of Chinese are not Han. It's easy to think white Caucasian when you say American, and that's absolutely not the case. We've got to have more of our ethnically diverse perspectives involved in U.S.-China relations. That's why I'm so excited when I see on college campuses these days more ethnic diversity within the China relations studies schools that we see. You know, you go to a Department of International Studies, you meet the China department, and you see the students who are there. I'm very excited about the fact that we see an increasing diversity among Americans in ethnicity when it comes to studying China. And I think we need to keep encouraging this in all ways. That's one thing I wanted to add about our earlier conversation about identity, to remember what and who we are as Americans, going right back to the question, what does it mean to be American? And it certainly doesn't mean to look like Chad. It means a lot more.
Great.
Yeah, well said. Well said. Yeah, well, first of all, Ben and Carson, thank you so much for the opportunity to visit with you folks. I feel like I've learned more probably than I've contributed, but that's not an unusual experience for me. I'll end with this. A story, one of the stories in this narrative of my journey in understanding or learning more and more about China, I received I was driving in my Ford truck, you know, out in rural Colorado, and I get this phone call from this very strange number. And I had some time to kill. I was driving a long way, so I picked up the phone, and it was a reporter from an international media source in Hong Kong. And he introduced himself, and I definitely recognized the publication, but I vaguely recognized him and his name, and he began to ask me some questions about basically what in the world is Firestone doing engaging China? What are you doing, and what does this look like? And he had a series of he's a very good reporter, and he was asking very strategic and well-worded questions that were really, at the end of the day, he was just puzzled by this idea that Firestone was interacting with communities and individuals, elected officials in China. Something new. It was something that he hadn't understood or that he hadn't seen before. And frankly, I still don't know if he has gotten to a point of resolution about it. But the reason I'm going to close with that and that story is because the world is looking at us, both of our countries and the citizens therein, to get this right and to do a good job with talking and building relationships. As Carson said, it doesn't mean we agree on everything or that either side is completely going to capitulate on any given topic. But they are looking to us to build relationship for the sake of a better global perspective, a better future down the road. It's puzzling to the world when they see us doing that, even at a micro level, because unfortunately it's pretty unusual. That needs to not be the case. I hope, if I could kind of echo some of the comments that Carson made, that we need to encourage folks in the United States to engage authentically and genuinely engage in these questions of what does it mean to be an American and what does it mean to, and find out what it means to be Chinese. Again, with the idea that when we do that, we're taking steps towards a much better world.
Wonderful, thank you. Thank you, gentlemen, for this talk. Two very experienced men, Chad Auer, former mayor of Firestone, Colorado, and current president of the U.S.-China Cooperative Association of Elected Local Officials, and Carson Tavenner, founder and executive director of Tai Initiative. Thank you so much, and we hope our viewers will join us for future very interesting and diverse topics we'll cover on the U.S.-China subnational relationship and the flows and dynamics within it. Until next time, I'm Ben Leffel, Director of Research for Tai Initiative, and we hope to see you again soon.
Thank you. Read, listen, and visit.